There is a specific discomfort that appears precisely when nothing needs to be done. The body slows, the environment quiets, time opens, and instead of relief, a subtle tension rises. Rest begins, but it doesn't settle. Something inside resists, as if pausing required justification, as if calm itself were slightly wrong. People who feel guilty when resting rarely describe themselves as anxious or overworked. They often say they just can't relax properly, or that they feel better when they're doing something useful. Stillness feels heavy. Free time feels charged. Even moments meant for recovery carry a background sense of obligation. In everyday life, this shows up quietly. Sitting down but reaching for a phone, taking a break but thinking about what should be done next, enjoying rest while simultaneously measuring how long it's lasting. The body may be resting, but the mind stays alert, monitoring whether the pause is acceptable. Because this guilt doesn't cause visible distress, it often goes unnoticed. Responsibilities are handled, productivity remains high. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. But internally, rest never feels clean. It feels borrowed, temporary, something that must be paid back later with effort. And beneath that unease, a quiet question begins to form. Not why am I tired, but why does stopping feel like I'm doing something wrong? This guilt around rest rarely appears on its own. It usually develops alongside early associations between worth and usefulness. At some point, being active meant being needed. Doing something meant being safe, valued, or responsible. Over time, the system learned a quiet rule. Slowing down requires permission, and permission must be earned. From a psychological perspective, guilt during rest functions as an internal regulator. It prevents disengagement before the system feels secure enough to stop. Even when there is no external pressure, the internal pressure remains. The mind keeps track of unfinished tasks, imagined expectations, or invisible standards. Rest is tolerated only in short doses, under supervision. Behaviorally, this creates a constant background calculation. How long is this break allowed to last? What should follow it? Is this rest productive enough? The person may not consciously ask these questions, but the tension reflects them. Relaxation is never complete because it's constantly evaluated. Over time, the system stops recognizing rest as recovery and starts treating it as risk. Pausing feels like falling behind. Enjoyment feels like neglect. The guilt isn't about laziness, it's about identity. If worth has been built on effort, then rest feels like stepping away from who one is supposed to be. There is a moment when this guilt becomes most noticeable. It appears not during work, but during pause. A free afternoon, a quiet evening, a break with no immediate demand attached. Instead of settling into ease, the mind starts scanning. Thoughts drift toward unfinished tasks, future obligations, or imagined expectations. Rest is interrupted before it can fully arrive. From a behavioral perspective, this happens because the system was trained to associate inactivity with vulnerability. When effort once prevented criticism, loss, or instability, stopping became risky. Even when circumstances change, the association remains. The body rests, but the mind stays on watch. Psychologically, this creates a split experience. One part wants recovery, another part monitors for consequences. Enjoyment is allowed only halfway. The person may relax physically, yet feel a persistent pull toward productivity. Doing nothing feels exposed, as if something essential is being neglected. Over time, this reinforces a subtle habit. Rest must be justified. It needs a reason, a limit, or a plan attached to it. Unstructured pause feels uncomfortable because it lacks proof of usefulness. The system prefers controlled breaks over genuine rest. This is often when the internal conflict becomes clear, not between work and rest, but between safety and ease. The guilt isn't asking for more effort, it's asking for reassurance that stopping won't cost anything. As this pattern repeats, it begins to shape how pleasure itself is experienced. Enjoyment becomes conditional. Calm must be earned. Rest has to come after effort, never before. Even then, it's monitored. The mind stays half engaged, checking whether the pause is justified, whether it's lasting too long, whether it will need to be compensated for later. From a psychological perspective, guilt during rest often reflects internal standards rather than real demands. The external pressure may be gone, but the internal rule remains active. Productivity becomes the baseline for self-approval. When output drops, self-acceptance wavers. The system doesn't ask, do I need rest? It asks, have I done enough to deserve it? Emotionally, this creates a muted relationship with pleasure. Joy is felt, but lightly. Relaxation is reached, but not trusted. The moment things soften, the mind tightens again.
not because something is wrong, but because ease feels undeserved. The nervous system stays slightly activated, even in safe conditions. Nothing dramatic collapses. Life continues to function. Goals are met, but recovery never fully restores. Energy is spent maintaining permission rather than being renewed. Over time, this leads to a quiet depletion, not from doing too much, but from never fully allowing oneself to stop. Over time, guilt around rest begins to shape identity. The person may come to see themselves as responsible, driven, or disciplined. These labels feel accurate. They explain the discomfort with stopping. They justify the constant effort. And they turn rest into something that must always be negotiated rather than assumed. Psychologically, identity built on usefulness creates a fragile balance. Value is maintained through activity.
When output slows, self-worth wavers. The person doesn't just feel idle, they feel uneasy about who they are in that moment. Rest becomes threatening, not because of what is lost externally, but because of what feels uncertain internally. Behaviorally, this shows up as overstructuring downtime. Breaks are filled with light productivity. Hobbies must be improving something. Relaxation is paired with learning, organizing, or planning. Pure rest feels wasteful. Doing nothing feels exposed. The system looks for ways to stay acceptable even while pausing. Over time, this narrows the experience of rest. Recovery exists, but it's shallow. The body stops, but the mind keeps score. The person appears functional and reliable, yet internally there is little space where nothing is required. And slowly, a deeper question forms beneath the effort. Who am I allowed to be when I'm not producing anything at all? The most important shift begins when guilt during rest is no longer seen as truth, but as conditioning. Not a moral signal, not a warning, a learned response. At some point, effort became linked to safety, approval, or stability. The system kept that rule long after the conditions changed. When this is recognized, the guilt doesn't vanish immediately, but it loses authority. It becomes something to notice rather than obey. The internal voice still appears, but it no longer defines what is right. Rest stops being framed as something to earn and starts being understood as something required. Psychologically, allowing rest means separating worth from usefulness. This can feel unsettling at first. Without effort, the system doesn't know what anchors value. Silence feels empty. Stillness feels exposed. But over time, another anchor emerges: presence without evaluation. The shift doesn't happen through permission granted once, but through repetition. Noticing guilt without responding to it. Letting pauses exist without justification. Allowing moments to remain unproductive without compensation. These small experiences teach the system something new. Stopping does not erase worth. It may be worth observing when guilt appears most strongly. What it predicts will happen if rest is allowed. Here, these patterns are observed calmly.